Ready-to-use self-storage, conveniently located near the Harmon McDonald's. We offer affordable rates, online payments, and auto bill pay for your convenience. Plus gate access daily from 6 a.m. to 9 p.m. Call us today at 648-7867 for more information.
Good morning, Guam, and thanks for starting your day the KUAM way. Of course, right here on Starting Lineup. Every weekday morning we have a Facebook Live show for you, and Tuesday's my day, so we're doing group chat and we're continuing our discussions on decolonization with the Executive Director of the Commission on Decolonization, Melvin Won Pat-Borja. Thanks again.
Thank you.
And so today we're kind of going to talk about, admittedly, a subject I don't really know much about. I mean, I have like kind of a cursory knowledge of the UN Declaration of
Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Rights of Indigenous People, UN Declaration, Rights of Indigenous, the UN DRIP.
Yeah, it's UN DRIP. Yeah,
the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. There you go. So we'll just call it the UNDRIP.
There you go.
I guess if you will. And so this is a document that's kind of evolved over the years, and I know that it was kind of the focus of what brought the Hawaiian indigenous activist Mililani Trask kind of to the forefront in the way that she used this document, right?
Right. So we were really excited to welcome Mililani Trask. She's a human rights attorney from Hawaii. She's Native Hawaiian activist. She's got a lot of experience with self-determination and decolonization work, but her expertise and what we're really focused on bringing her out was her work with the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So she actually was one of the people who helped author that declaration. She worked for 22 years to do that work, because prior to the declaration, there was no UN language that recognized the rights of indigenous peoples. It was really only the rights of the territory. So in a lot of ways, what was problematic was that it was separating our colonial experience from the colonial experience of the land. And we know that in indigenous perspective, there is no disconnect. The land and the people are intricately connected. And we have this very woven relationship, right, where we create this balance, a sense of balance between our lives and the land. And so the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was really a vehicle to help recognize not only the experience of the colonial people, but also the rights that they inherently have and that are not recognized. And so what's important about this is that it was created in 2007, and then the following year in 2008, the United Nations declared or asserted that their opinion was that the declaration is, whereas normally a declaration is not a binding document, it's just an assertion by a body. In this case, because there were so many implications of what those rights meant to the overall conversation of the decolonization struggle, is that there has to be a recognition of the rights of the people. And so now, after 2008, the UN basically asserted that this document is binding and does have implications to all other international treaties. So in other words, for us, right, a lot of our decolonial issues are rooted in the Treaty of Paris, because the Treaty of Paris is an international binding agreement between Spain and the United States.
Right.
And in that agreement, they were given Congress was then given the responsibility to advance the civil and political rights of the native inhabitants. And so that now is being defined by the UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Right, and so why we're talking about this is because Mililani Trask was actually one of the featured guests at the Fanhita Decolonization Conference. So I think one of the things that has been lacking before is, while people in Guam's decolonization movement have been aware of other decolonization struggles around the world, we haven't, on Guam, at least in my memory, sat and broke bread together the way that they did during this Fanhita Decolonization Conference. So I thought it was cool to bring, like-minded people with, facing similar struggles right here on Guam, and it kind of raised a lot of awareness for the issues.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It was a great thing for us to be able to gather these minds, in our community, and not just to hear from them and to kind of gain that perspective and that knowledge of their experience, but also for us to be able to directly engage them, and so that was part of the way that we did the conference, was that we wanted to create an opportunity for our community to engage the experts, to spark a dialogue. But we also did, and you'll see in the rebroadcast of the conference, we also conducted these interviews on the side to be able to really ask them direct questions to unpack their statements.
Right.
And so the only thing that was really done in this way, or along the same vein prior to this, was in the 90s, when there was a conference hosted in DC that featured all of the U.S. territories. So it was Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, and Hawaii. Even though Hawaii was not one of the territories, it was included as part of this conference. And that conference was actually coordinated between several of the non-self-governing territory governments and the United States State Department. And so prior to that, there was, or since that time, there's been a very limited amount of engagement between the territories and the State Department. Primarily, our interaction is limited to the Department of Interior. Now, in this case, in that case, in the 90s with this conference, the State Department was heavily involved, and so they really put pressure on DOI to help support the event. And what was nice about it was that there were a lot of high-level federal officials that attended this conference. They actually pressed a book where there's statements of all the non-self-governing territories. Governor Joseph Atta delivered this really iconic opening address where he introduces himself as the governor of the U.S. colony of Guam, and he says that we should continue to call Guam a colony because that's what it is, and that the term unincorporated territory could mean so many different things and is so ambiguous, but it really it takes away from the reality that we are in a colonial relationship. And so it's nice to, for me, I was just a kid at that time, and so part of my my education was to rediscover this writing and these statements. And so I managed to get a copy of they made a book with all the statements and they pressed it. I got a copy from the Lieutenant Governor. It's a really great read.
That's cool because you don't hear the federal government talking about our political status.
Right,
Like it's
right.
crickets. They don't say anything.
Absolutely.
They don't address it. It's the biggest elephant in the room.
And I think that's a big part of it, is that we know that we're only going to get so much back from them. And so part of it is not only us sharing in the experience of that others have faced, but also for them to share their experience dealing with the federal government and allowing that interaction also to inform us. There's a lot of things that we can learn from the way that these other territories have interacted with the feds. And I think that Hawaii is a really great example because, Hawaii has a very similar but also a very nuanced relationship with the feds. They are similar to us in the sense that their political status was chosen for them, right? The Kingdom of Hawaii was annexed by force, and was done without popular referendum, similar to the way that our political status was kind of enacted. The difference really is the violent vehicle that allowed it to happen.
Right.
So for the Kingdom of Hawaii, obviously, if you know the history, the Native Hawaiians call it the Bayonet Constitution because their queen was held at gunpoint and literally forced to sign the annexation. She was even held captive and isolated from her people. Now, for us, it wasn't done in the exact same way, but there was still no popular referendum that elected our status. The other part of it is that our status was not meant to be a permanent status.
Right.
It was really just meant to solve the citizenship issue, but it was not meant to be long-standing.
Right.
And so it's really interesting to see the relationship that the Native Hawaiians have with the federal government and some of the things that they've done to pursue their self-determination, because it's a very different relationship.
Yeah, and because they're a state, a lot of times, and I'll admit, even personally, years ago, I just went to their state, but there's still Native Hawaiians who are not happy with.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that...
And Trask is one of them.
Absolutely, and that's one of the things that she talks about in the conference, was that you know, a lot of times when we talk about status, when we talk about self-determination through the vehicle of status, what happens is that the conversation becomes very divisive because she claims that the statuses are not built by us. They're built by the colonizer, and it's really a colonial tool. And so when we think about it in that framework, it becomes very contentious, right? We tend to start pitting ourselves against each other, which is extremely divisive. But she says that if we start around the conversation of self-determination and decolonization, like the central focus is to increase our level of sovereignty, our rights, recognize our rights as a people, and to really push for a higher level of self-governance, then what happens is that we are focused primarily on righting the historical wrong,
Okay.
rather than figuring out, okay, we're going to fight over, is it going to be statehood or independence or free
Right.
association.
Let's go ahead and play this. We got a couple clips here from Mililani Trask now. The Fanhita conference, you guys broke it up into chunks, and it's on the
Right.
YouTube, Commission on Decolonization YouTube. And so this first clip we're going to play, I guess we just play it and then talk about it after. Okay.
Small
Group
lightning
chat.
bolt comes out of the United Nations system to strike the USA.
The Fanhita
In
conference.
2008, the United States was called to file their report under the United Nations Binding Convention to eliminate racial discrimination.
There's a dedicated channel because I'm going to bring up
The U.S. filed their report, and in response, there were documents that were filed from Hawaii, from the Trust Territory,
Decolonization on YouTube.
from the American Indian
Or you can,
Nations, east to
subs
west
on the PDF.
coast, and from the Yupik, Inupiat peoples of Alaska,
This one.
all the indigenous of the United States, filed in response in 2008. Well, the United States, in their responding document, has a long section about why we were wrong. Because under international law, declarations are not binding conventions. They are not. Declarations are nothing more than statements of aspiration. And so in comes Department of Justice, solicitor from Interior, long analysis. Declaration is not binding on the United States of America. To which the third committee, and I just love those guys, they come out with a famous one-liner. While noting the position of the state party, they don't even say United States. While noting the position of the state party with regards to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, the committee finally recommends that the declaration will be used as the guide to interpret the state party's binding obligation under the convention as it relates to indigenous people. One statement. And in this one statement, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples became the document by which the U.S. obligations under all binding human rights conventions are now being interpreted.
There we go.
The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples became
Oh, there you go. So she kind of talks about what you had discussed earlier, is that this document, which started as a declaration, kind of evolved into a document that's more like a treaty and a binding.
Right. So the thing that we got to understand with the United Nations is that there are declarations and then there are treaties. There are resolutions and then there are treaties. The treaties are really the only things that have teeth in an international court of law, right? It's the only thing that can be held against a state, a sovereign state. And so when we think about declarations, they don't really mean anything for the most part. It's just an assertion. It's kind of like a resolution in the legislature. It's not a law. It's not a bill. It's just a statement.
Right.
But in
On
this
the
case,
record.
on the record, it's an official statement. But the difference between this declaration and others is that after this declaration was created, the United Nations came out and said that this declaration will now be the basis for how we understand what the responsibility is of the state to these people. And so for our struggle, what this means is that the United States has an international obligation to recognize our rights and to support our movement towards decolonization.
And so this is why we go to the UN every year.
Right.
Pretty much.
Because we know, and you know, again, we've talked about this before, but the Commonwealth Draft Act really was the farthest that we've ever come. And when the Commonwealth Draft Act was basically shot down in committee and didn't even make it to the floor, you know, part of that challenge was that the government of Guam did not want to negotiate with mutual consent or immigration. Those were the two items that they weren't willing to surrender. But those were the two items that the federal government wanted to hold hostage in order to move on the Commonwealth Draft Act. And so as long as we didn't have that agreement, they basically said, look, we're not moving forward on this, and that's the end of it. If you don't want to deal and negotiate in this way, then the Commonwealth Draft Act is dead. And so once that happened, Governor Addis straight up came out and said that without mutual consent, you know, the people of Guam can never truly be empowered. And so we're not going to negotiate with mutual consent. And so, in other words, our self-determination movement for Commonwealth ended in that moment. And so once that happened, that's really the point when our government started to engage deliberately with the UN. And that was the reason why, is that we knew that our negotiations were always going to have this glass ceiling with the feds. And so we had to find another way to assert that we wanted these rights to be recognized. And so I think that's really the meat of this, the point that she's trying to make here, is that, you know, we do have these rights, and these rights are recognized by not only an international community, but even the United States themselves.
Right.
And so it's really our responsibility to assert that we have a right to this and that we want to pursue it.
Right, and I think that kind of gets lost in the conversation as people get, oh, why do you want to decolonize? Why do you want to? And it's not, the U.S. has agreed that this is what we're going to do.
Right, we've all agreed upon this, and this is something that, you know, this is coming after earlier in Mililani.
I just want to direct that to Frank Chargaloff here in the comments. Get to the point, what is your drive to have Guam decolonized? And again, the drive is that this is something that has been agreed on by the administering power and the international
I mean, it's really been agreed upon by the world. You know, it's not, we are not, that's the thing that I think is really important to point out, is that there are only 17 non-self-governing territories left in the world. You know, prior to that declaration, or to that, you know, that listing, there were multiple countries who had a prior colonial relationship who have since decolonized.
I mean, Hong Kong is one of them.
Yeah, the vast majority of the world
example.
has become either independent, either integrated, or freely associated. And Guam, along with the other 17, have not. You know, and so it's not like this is a new thing. It's not like this is a trendy thing that we're just kind of jumping on the bandwagon.
Hashtag decol.
Yeah, you know,
it's not. And we talked about this in I think it was the first discussion on decolonization, where there was this kind of gap in action on the Commission on Decolonization, you know, for several years. And so it's kind of led to this generational lack of, like guys like Frank Chargaloff, who's just walking around, no clue about what's going on. And, you know, it's unfortunate.
It is unfortunate.
And it really doubles up the amount of work that you guys have to do.
It does, especially because there's been, I mean, obviously there's a ton of work that's been done on an international, global level that a lot of people are unaware of. But I think what's more damaging is that there's been a lot of work done here on the ground locally. There's been a lot of people who have literally laid their lives on the line for this work. And it's almost as if they've done nothing. You know, to a lot of our people, it's like, well, you know, what have we done? And why now all of a sudden are we talking about it? When that's not really the case. You know, the reality is that we've been doing this for generations. I mean, even prior to the Commonwealth Draft Act, you know, there are a lot of, Hurrah was after self-determination. Hurrah was after decolonization. You know, there's our history of resistance.
Hurrah, hurrah!
Yeah, like the hurrah. I mean, think about it. The Chamorro-Spanish War was a 20-year war. Yeah. You know, it was an assertion that we did not want to live under the gun of the Spanish, that we wanted to have a right to, you know, to our own freedom here on our homeland. And so, this is an age-old struggle. It's something that, I even believe that a lot of our ancestors who are extremely patriotic and really loyal to the United States root that loyalty in the possibility of freedom. That during that time, post World War II, they recognized that the world was in global conflict. And here's the United States, who's one of the major superpowers, in the global fight, who is asserting this idea of freedom, democracy, equality, and we wanted that. We thought, we really bought into that idea. Like, hey, let's be Americans. Let's have these rights. Let's have an opportunity to pursue those rights and be treated fairly, be treated with human dignity and respect. And then I think that, as we've seen historically, that's not necessarily what we got.
It's funny. It just reminds me of whatever you just talk about this. It reminds me of Eloy Hera, who is with the Statehood Commission, and he likes to tell this story. And this guy is patriotic as they come. You know what I mean? He's for statehood. But he talks about being caught up in that and joining the Navy, and then wanting to serve America and being the subject of racism and discrimination in that Navy. And so it's something he talks about openly, and I think it's kind of along the lines of what you're saying. And we got to get this next clip on, so we're going to play the second clip of Mililani Trask, and I guess we'll play the clip and come back and then do some unpacking.
Self-determination is the right of all peoples, the peoples themselves, to freely determine their political status and to freely pursue economic, cultural, and social development. So the question of determining our political status must spring from the people. Start there. When I see the vibrancy of the Chamorro people, I'm uplifted. In Hawaii, we have many, many viewpoints of the Hawaiian people. We have at least 6 who push for independence. We have several who have already created their own independent supporting organizations. We have some that want to continue to be wards of the state. We even had a few that were being courted by the Department of Interior, who were saying, look, what's wrong with being an Indian? We're Native American, aren't we? So you have a great proliferation of opinions. It's dangerous ground because it's the legacy of colonization to create issues so that the indigenous will fight among themselves. Avoid that threat by supporting self-determination instead of independence as they define it, free association as they define it, Commonwealth status. What we need to be are indigenous Hawaiians. When you call your people together for building consensus, if you call for the hui, the gathering, to look at self-determination, to address issues, maintaining our lands, our resources, preserving our culture and the vehicles of it, including language and the practice of traditional medicine. These things bring us together. When we form the platform based on those cultural priorities, unity builds. When you call a gathering of Hawaiians together to look at independence, free association, Commonwealth status, the status quo, what happens is all the factions come to fight. Those things were not created by our people. What we are doing is defining self-determination. And from that, going forward for cultural, economic, and social development. Well, when you look at that, consider this. If we didn't move forward with self-determination ourselves, we would still be stuck in the circular disagreement going nowhere. We're in the
we must rally support first around decolonization, around self-determination, the principle of it. And that's what I think we've done well so far, is that we really try to position the commission in a place where we're not trying to get caught up on status. Even
Right.
in my conversations with the task forces themselves, I've been very clear. Look, you guys know the work. You guys are out in the community. You know the challenges of trying to teach about your status. Every time you try to talk about the status, people still have baseline questions. People want to know about the process, about our rights. And so it's really important for us to establish what those things are and to rally our community around that concept first before we start talking about status. Now, when we talk about it, what I love about what she's saying is that self-determination has to be addressed upon the premise that we are asserting our right to these lands, our right to our cultural, economic, social development. And all of those things can be accomplished through pursuit of any of these political statuses.
Right.
But I think the important thing is that we all are rallying around the idea that this is what we want. We want to be treated with dignity. And that's what I thought was great about the Finogi March. You know, the Finogi March, a lot of people don't realize the Finogi March was not a COD event. We almost had nothing to do with it. We showed up and we supported what they're about because it's in line with our mission. But the Finogi March was really spearheaded by a bunch of people just in the community,
Right.
who felt like, you know, their rights were being ignored. That, you know, because of this Davis case, that they were being told that they didn't have this right to assert their political desires for self-determination. And so what we saw in the Finogi March was 2,000 people gathering on a Saturday morning to march to protect their right to self-determination. I thought what was beautiful about
That
it,
was so beautiful.
it was not just Chamorros that were out there.
Yeah.
There
There was
were
some white folk out there.
Yeah,
too.
there was a lot of white folks out there. There's a whole group of Filipinos. They even
Right.
made their own shirts.
Right,
Filipinos for Chamorro self-determination. I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing is
Saw
that...
some friends from Yap there too.
Oh
also,
yeah, absolutely. There was a
supporting Chamorro
really large
self-determination.
Micronesian contingent, which was great. And I think that when we see that, what we're recognizing is that there are other people who understand that this is an important thing, that we have to support each other in this move. Now, what I also want to point out is that none of those people came out saying, you know what, we just don't want to have any voice in this conversation at all. What they did instead was come out and say, we respect the assertion of the indigenous people who have been
They can vote on
wronged. And what we are now saying is that we support their push to have that say, to have that voice restored. And once that voice is restored, that's when all of us are going to get involved. We cannot exclude anybody from the conversation on a whole.
Right.
But in terms of the assertion of a desire, that's something that was taken from the indigenous people, the native inhabitants.
And going back to the Trask clip you played, I think it's really interesting because I spent a lot of time with the task forces, and it's so funny how they can go from debating the benefits or, even some of the negatives of statehood or independence or free association, and then in the same breath, unite and talk about the need to decolonize.
Right.
So I thought the points that she was making, I mean, we haven't had that kind of heated
Right.
discussion on Guam, but as things get closer to the plebiscite, we'll see what happens.
Oh, absolutely.
Hey, I want to thank you for sharing your time. I know you're a very busy guy. We just put a poll up here. Do you support decolonization? A hearty yes for both of us. And so that's going to be up there. And hey, what do we got in store for next week?
Next week, I really wanted to talk about some of our community movements. One of the things that we didn't touch on that Mililani Trask brought up in her statement was that she talked about how the Native Hawaiian community really try to deliberately involve faith-based organizations. And she said that these are the people who had supported them from the beginning because the moral principles that drive the church often support the pursuit of civil and human rights. And so, I think that this is something that is really is important for our movement. Obviously, the Catholic Church is strong in our islands, powerful. extremely powerful. I mean, you see
I've
when
always wondered, where do they stand on decolonization?
I'm very curious too. You know, we've been really trying to push to meet with the archdiocese and have this conversation. You know, obviously the archdiocese is dealing with a lot right now, and so you know it's not an easy conversation to have. But I think that it's important. You know, if we're gonna do this right, we got to get everybody involved. You know, and so I think that there's a lot of value in engaging the faith-based organizations, but it's not just the faith-based organizations. There's a lot of organizations who do work in our community on a social level, on an educational level, that definitely can align their missions with what we are doing. You know, there's a lot of implications about the right to this that people don't connect with their faith. You know, which I think is really important. You know, I mean, most faith conversations are directed in this idea that each person has this right to dignity, you know, has a right to be treated with dignity. And that's something that I often think is missing from the conversation. So I would really like to talk about the way that we get other organizations involved.
Let's do it. Let's
and
make
we'll
it
see what
happen.
happens.
So
Yeah.
Miguel just posted a rather
Yeah.
meaty
So
comment.
Dr. Bavacqua here chimes in. Thanks for taking care of our light work for us, Doc. Kind of responding to some of the comments, questions that we had, and I was going to get into the comments, but again, such wide, open-ended. Hey, and Anita McHale, she's posted a few. Anita wants more information. There's a website you guys
Yes,
are
you can
all
go
over.
to decall.guam.gov. There's a lot of documents there that's from our archive. There's we have some of the UN documents there, some of our historical documents, and all of it is organized by subtopic. And so you can click on the economy or the tab for governance, and it'll give you a little bit of an idea of what are the implications of self-determination or decolonization on our economy, on our foreign affairs, on our defense, on our governance, and then it gives you some historical documents that give you some further reading.
Anita, if I were you, definitely follow Mel's advice and kind of start at the beginning. Go back to self-determination and decolonization before you kind of get into the statuses, because I've been to that point where you're just reading about all these different things at the same time, and it's
Right.
like, overload. So start at the beginning, and I got Dr. Bavacqua here writes, residents within the territory don't have rights but privileges that are afforded them by the
Right.
U.S. Congress. This is because while states and independent countries have their own authority or sovereignty because of their constitution and their place within the U.S., a territory doesn't. And you've got to remember, like, every significant self-governance stride that we've made has come as a result of
Oh, absolutely.
lobbying the U.S.
I think that's a really good point because a lot of people don't know much about the insular cases and the territorial clause, which are both really important pieces to the conversation. The insular cases are essentially what established that only certain rights will be given to the people of the territories. Now, the insular cases, I should say, were decided in the early 1900s. And
Subhumans.
yeah,
right?
they're clearly racist laws. I mean, my favorite quote from the insular cases was that the territories are populated with alien races who do not have the understanding of Anglo-Saxon principles, and so we cannot be assimilated into these communities, and so that therefore only certain rights from the Constitution should apply, and others shouldn't. And then the same thing with the territorial clause, which is actually in the Constitution, which says that Congress should be given the right to basically remove or apply whatever rights they see fit. And so I think that that's right along with Dr. Bavacqua's point that we don't really have rights, we have privileges. We have privileges that are rights to other Americans, but and those same rights don't always apply to us. So,
And one thing about privileges, if they're given, they can be taken away.
right, and that's what the territorial clause says. They can give us rights or they can take them away. Give us privileges or take them away.
All right. So on that note, man, great discussion on decolonization. Again, next Tuesday, we'll be talking about what he said.
Community
Faith-based organizations and how we can hopefully fold them into the discussion on decolonization. Again, decall.guam.gov. You guys have YouTube, Twitter, Instagram. Just really pushing out a lot of information. So good job. You get on any of those sites. And thanks, Mel. We'll see you next
Thank
Tuesday.
you.
My name's Chris. There's been group chat discussions on decolonization. Hasta Jos.
Yes.